So welcome to Show Studio Book Club.
Thank you.
Today it's great to have you here. And we're here today to talk about your new book, which has an incredible title. It's called Paradise Found, an Erotic Treasury for Sybarites.
Exactly.
Talk me through a little bit about the title and where the idea for the book came from.
The title Paradise Found is actually the name I gave to my erotic jewelry collections in 2001, when I decided that I would actually ignore everything that had happened for the decade before, which was basically being pushed back, etc., being told that I couldn't do that, and there being no market. Well, I kind of listened. No. In 2001, after September 11, I decided that I would pursue it anyway, take the leap, and Paradise Found became the name of the collection. Mm-hmm. The idea of creating a treasury of 30 years of work came because I had time, to do it. So I wanted to sort of put a ribbon around this body of work, which is, has taken me on a very, very articulated and unexpected journey. Let's put it that way,
How would you describe yourself?
I didn't know when I started, of course, 30 years ago to do the erotic jewelry, that I would also become an author by obligation somehow. And so I wanted to encourage exploration, safe exploration of the erotic realm, which is so much broader and wider than what most people view it as, I mean, even with all of the access that we have to pornography today, most of it is just about penetrative sex, Mm-hmm. And of course, I design objects that are made to explore the body as a whole, from head to toe. When I started this, I was very naive. I was 22 when I started the first collection, which I coined the term Sado Chic, mm-hmm. which today we see it around, but mm-hmm. I actually had to find a way to bring this language into a luxury realm and make it feel safe. I mean, I've worked in luxury forever. I'm a jeweler. I use gold, silver, platinum, diamonds, etc. And so it was sort of like filling a white space. Throughout the 90s, I received a lot of pushback, and I was also designing other collections under my own brand. And when I showed it to, so-called cutting-edge stores like Barney's New York and the like, they were like, "You can't do that. What are you doing? You're a pervert." I was given the pervert a lot. And I understood then that I'd hit a nerve. And I worked mostly for myself and for private clients. I built the boudoir box so that I could travel to my clients. I was also too young to understand the relationship between sex, politics, power, or lack thereof. And the jewelry gave me this opportunity to expand my horizons and my understanding. And today, I guess you could consider me a sexual activist. Mm-hmm. I've been working to dismantle the pleasure taboo simply by diffusing information about the body, sex, and pleasure, which is complicated in a world where speaking about sex from a didactic or educational point of view is actually banned. Somehow or another, I guess that's what I was put here to do. It's not always safe. There's a lot of space for misinterpretation and projection. And I also learned over the years that it doesn't matter what people think, and that I am going to remain at service, at your service, at everyone's service, in the name of pleasure.
I think it's very interesting how we sort of allowed to consume sexual topics and sexual imagery only in a certain way, like you mentioned, of course, pornography, and it's always treated as this very marginalized topic, which is supposed to be in its own box, and you can't really take it out of the box and bring it to like wider cultural discourse. So I think that's why people who often try to talk about sexual subjects through art or through design, they get a lot of pushback from kind of more conservative people with more traditional mindset. So if we come back to the book, how would you sort of describe it? Because you said it's probably 30 years of work which went into this, in between these two covers, and just really interested in also the combination of imagery and words which is in the book. So how did it all come together?
So the Boudoir Bible it never referenced my jewelry specifically. I wanted to bring something democratic to my work. Paradise Found, on the other hand, is all about the jewelry. And I wanted to give a second life to certain images that, I mean, many of the images in the book were actually published. For example, the images by Nick Knight were published in wallpaper. And then that was it. So I wanted to give those images eternity somehow. No, a book is eternal. I also thought that it would be opportune to talk about the use of the pieces, the journey, and again, share those images with a wider public. And I left, you know, probably 100 photographers out of it, not by choice, but just because there were only so many pages in the book. Yeah, the difference between the Boudoir Bible and Paradise Found is that Paradise Found is only about the jewelry. And it picks up on topics that are also explored in a more universal way in the Boudoir Bible, but visually. It was, I guess the biggest challenge was to put, well, 1, 30 years of photography all in one place. 2, to make it flow, no? And so I worked with the art director, Thomas Linthal, in Paris. And Thomas said, I think the way that we can do this and resolve the riddle of flow is to use beautiful matte paper. And so he really fought for that matte paper. And I have to say that he really made the right choice. And Rizzoli accepted it. And in terms of text, it was an opportunity for me to explain how the jewelry was also a vehicle for a wider, larger mission than just making ornaments or sexual objects, no? You may know that I took the term toy out of our sexuality as adults. I began to work with pleasure, and I found myself also working with trauma. And so these objects allowed me to do that. The jewelry allowed me to do that in a very subliminated way, in a very safe way. No? And so in the little bit of text that is there, I explain both the function of the jewelry, how it works, and a little bit about the story and the path that it took me down, which again was super unexpected. When I was 22, I had no idea what I was getting myself into, which is it's a lifelong career in the end. I feel sometimes like it's only just begun. Nick, of course, has always been a huge ally and someone who was never afraid of talking about eroticism and sexuality. And it's thanks to people like him that my path has been, you know, I've been able to continue walking it.
Do you have any favorite erotic books from the past?
Of course. I think the best way to learn a language is to read erotica, no? And the collection, in fact, on the cover of Paradise Found, there's a piece of jewelry, which again is called, it's like one of the main pieces in the Satoshi collection. And I didn't invent the wheel in that sense, you know? And I loved the story of O. And that collection is inspired by the story of O. Of course, Venus in Furs. We could make big, long erotic lists, no? Of literature that are musts.
Yeah, I think erotic books and erotic writing has a really interesting space in culture today, because if we look back in the past, that's how people kind of consume, that's how people used to like arouse themselves and how they used to consume this content mostly. But now that we're so visually driven, I feel like it almost has a different role now, somehow. Story of O is an incredible book. It's actually, I think, it's the first content of like, let's say, BDSM related literature I've ever read personally. And I can remember it really viscerally. And same, it was great to see, you know, this jewelry with O-rings has a long history also. I know that people used to wear the rings especially to recognize each other, and they still do, like in the US, it's quite big in like the queer BDSM scene. And so it's great to have to be part of that history. And I guess what I wanted to ask also is, when did you realize you were interested in eroticism and kind of maybe sexual subjects? When was it? Did you always have it, or?
I think that we're all born with the sexual curiosity. It's an innate thing that is pushed down by our parents, by the establishment. And I've asked myself a lot over the years, and I think I found the answer to the question of, why our sexuality is denied rather than celebrated as something sacred. And I think that the answer is that our sexual energy is the most powerful force of our nature and nature in general. It brings us here. It unites us. And contrary to public belief, it is something that we also die with, Particularly women have been told, after menopause, you're no longer a sexual creature, which is absolutely false. So I think that the establishment tried to remove the sacred from our sex lives, because the sexually empowered are also empowered in every other way. So my biggest challenge over the past 30 years has been finding a way to communicate, to promote the work in spite of all the banning. And it's really been through word of mouth and through really brave journalists and editors who decided to celebrate it with me, Without them, I wouldn't be here, because if you're not allowed to stand in the light and you're pushed into the darkness, then you have no voice. And I think that as a woman, sometimes I think of woman with someone with a hand over her mouth, silenced. And in many moments, I've been silenced.
When did sort of your interest in jewelry and making things came together with your interest in erotic subjects? Or was it always there?
It happened in the 90s. I mean, the Saddle Chic collection was born in 92. And I was way ahead of the curve, However, in the fashion system, we had radicals like Vivienne Westwood, and Galliano had done a collection around different kinds of loving, and Versace too in 1992. And the fashion was different, It was less of a consumer good. It was sort of anti-fashion up until a certain point, And talking about fashion and pleasure, or fashion and sexuality, there is something that must be said. Fashion can be sexy, but I discovered through my work that it couldn't be sexual. So in the moment that you actually talk about enhanced pleasure, or the fact that I could take this ring, spin it around, and give you an incredible massage, it became suddenly uncomfortable. I had clients saying to me, you can't do that. How am I going to talk about this on the shop floor? Who's going to describe this? How can you put that with a jewelry collection on the floor? Sometimes the work was so discreet, and the actual erotic function or sexual function or sensual function, because it's not just sexual. My aim is to stroke all of the senses through my work, right? Sometimes that functionality was so embedded and so sort of discreetly hidden in the shapes that no one thought about it. So actually this ring I sold on the floor of Liberties in 1995, And I just didn't say, you can spin it on the inside of your hand and do something magic that you couldn't do with your body alone. So I'm very fascinated by the way that we can augment the body through design.
I think it's a very interesting distinction you made between sexy and sexual, because I think sexy is quite often about looking sexy, while sexual is more about being actively participating or actively doing something, which I think is, especially for women, I think it's been a bit of a a bit of a hurdle when it's okay for you to be perceived as desirable, but when you yourself want to kind of be an active participant, it's not as good anymore. What is the difference, you'd say, how your work used to be perceived and how it is perceived now, and when did that change happen, if it became more kind of celebrated and just people became a bit easier about talking about these things?
Well, I kept insisting. And even today, you know, there is still so much misinterpretation, and the battle is still ongoing, you know. And I think maybe in this moment we are more than ever required to fight for our sexual rights, to stand up for our sexual persona, especially as women. But not only as women, also as men. You know, sometimes I think that there's a danger in dividing things too much, because men were told for 2,000 years, your sexuality is more important, your pleasure is bigger, and you are innately more educated, and therefore you're going to teach women how to experience pleasure, no? Which is a huge weight to put on a man, because it's not true. They are not more sexually empowered or intelligent, no? And this is why I've always worked for everyone. I'm not interested in your gender, I'm not interested in, I mean, I think that we're all sexual beings. I am absolutely for the pleasure of all. There's so much sexual information. I mean, children from the age of 5 on are getting pornographic info, no? Visual information, not willingly. A 5-year-old is not going to tap in sex. They might tap in toys. Mm-hmm. And in the corner of the screen, there is suddenly a woman who's mimicking with her breasts prominent and ready. She's ready, you know, or an advertisement for a tool, or for a sex shop, or a pornographic link, no? So something as innocent as tapping toy. Do it yourself, try it, and you'll see why children are being exposed to porn from the moment they're being given an iPhone or a tablet or have access to a computer. What does that do to us, you know, in the end? This is what we're going to see the effects of, and we're already seeing the effects of. I've worked with an 18-year-old boy, the son of a collector of mine, who has erectile dysfunction at the age of 18. And they're really not interested in real sex. They think that it's absolutely useless, real sex. So how is that going to shape our sexuality in the years to come?
I feel like it's always such a tricky conversation, because people get really emotional when they talk about sex. It's very personal, there's so many opinions. So yeah, it is really like a tricky terrain.
I think the important thing is that we understand that porn is the worst teacher.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And so yes, you're getting pornographic imagery or sexual imagery, but not information about pleasure enhancement.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, yeah.
And that's why I wrote the Boudoir Bible.
Yeah.
And that's why, in spite of the fact that there's still very few places that are interested in carrying the erotic jewelry, this is why I've gone back to sort of a couture concept. And my clients, they find me, they are interested in the intimacy factor and working closely to have things made to measure, have things made to suit their desires, to learn as well. This is why the work also led me to do experiential spaces, and I'm working on a new one in Italy, which is going to be exciting. So yeah, I think it's true. You know, we have access, but mostly to pornographic imagery.
Yeah.
And still this lack of access to concrete information, about pleasure, because again, as I say in the Boudoir Bible, and I continue to say it today, the taboo is not around sex. There is no more sexual taboo. We know that the internet, for example, was, it was given the space that it's given today after trying to see what would happen with the sharing of information, and it happened to be sexual information. And the net started to be woven thanks to porn. There was an exchange, and people were like, wow, this is amazing. Now, it was only 1994, it wasn't that long ago. we're talking about not even 30 years yet ago, no? So I think we have to be careful to not confound pornographic information with pleasure enhancement information.
Yeah, I think that's what people often say is that instead of banning things and trying to limit what people see, you have to invest in sex education, and then you'd have like people who are basically more educated about what information they consume. So
I think education is the word where we're missing. You know, that we're missing the education. We're getting the visuals. But did you know that, for example, in the United States of America, which tends to be one of the most prohibitive in the Western world, because outside of the Western world, there's a lot of prohibition and a lot of pushback. But if a school system teaches anything but abstinence education, they get no state funding or no federal funding. So we're still in this,
crazy,
yes, but you can still watch porn all night long if you want to.
Yeah, yeah.
So my work was a response to that also. You know, I wanted to bring in the idea of sacred, because I do believe that it's a sacred energy. I think it's naive to think also that we can consume, as you say, sex as if it was sort of like a fast food product or a fast product in general. I've also worked with people who have porn addiction. My work led me, the jewelry led me to do a lot of things, and one of those was to become a clinical hypnotherapist. And again, I found myself working in trauma. I was super naive. I thought, oh, everybody wants to have a great sex life like you and me, no? And in reality, I found myself up against a lot of people who have been sexually abused, and the effects of that abuse is something that I became very much in contact with, thanks to the jewelry. And the jewelry made a safe space. They were like, it became in one way like armor to protect me in this mission that I didn't know I was going to find myself on, but also a cushion to be able to talk about sex, also in a fashion magazine or a lifestyle magazine. And one of the ways that I kept myself afloat was to be able to move into all of those areas, because I'm a designer, I'm also an artist, I'm an author. I also work in sexual wellness. So somehow or another, I was always sprinkling around or opening up the doors and the options so that I didn't get shut down in one. Well, these are pieces that I wear every day. And I actually feel naked without them. When I leave the house without them, I feel as if something's missing. I have a lot of favorite pieces. The Paradise Found erotic, well, it was actually called the Paradise Found Fine Erotic Jewellery Collection, is composed of 420 pieces. And about 80% of the collection can actually be worn out with discretion, like you wouldn't know, no? My work is empowering. I've watched people become empowered by just knowing that this is a piece of jewelry, but I can also please my mate with it, no? And please myself with it, because it feels very nice. No? So the Love Lock is maybe one of my favorites. And yeah, I didn't bring jewelry today, but lots of favorites.
It's great to see that one. It's beautiful. I think when people talk about objects and sexuality, there's always a word fetish and there's always a word fetishism, which exists in that discourse. So would you describe yourself as a fetishist?
Yes, I think I'm a fetishist. I think we all are, you know.
I agree, actually.
And one of the things that I really try to do is to give people permission to explore that by normalizing our pleasure and our fetishes. And I also try to move things out of categorization. In the moment that certain pleasures are only considered SM, for example, it makes a whole side of the sexually mature adults afraid maybe to try them because they're going to get categorized. No? So one of the things that I did with the Boudoir Bible was to break down this idea of category, like put it aside. I think that categories become like limits and limitations. I think we're all fetishists. I think we all want to have a better sex life. I think that we all innately understand the importance of pleasure in our lives and how it allows us to build relationships that are solid. What is more solid than a pleasure bond? What keeps a couple together? It's often pleasure. I mean, for me, it is pleasure. And when pleasure is not there, then you know, a couple can also become very asexual. and maybe find that food is the key to stroking and satisfying desire. No? I mean, it's also the same side of the brain. Sexual pleasure and food have a very similar pathway, neural pathway in the brain. It's the same side of the brain, let's say, desire in general. But I also believe, firmly believe, that physical contact is very important. And I know this through also my studies in psychology and in neurology. The human touch is very powerful. And we know that, for example, a newborn child that is not held and that is not touched is not only negatively affected from a mental point of view, but it can also die.
I feel like there's always a certain community which is connected to it. There's a certain subculture even connected to that as well. Like, I mean, I would probably describe myself as someone who's in that community in London. So have you ever had a community like that, or who were the people you sort of explored these things with?
Absolutely. Yeah, we're part of the same community. For me, you know, growing up in the 80s, actually being initiated by the community was really important because it was really underground. And in the 80s, for example, people that explored bondage or had playrooms or were into erotic play were also still slightly in danger, no? If someone had a playroom, for example, and there was a conflict in the couple and there was a separation, a playroom could actually have you lose the children or lose your rights or put you in a very weak position, no? So people were hiding them. In fact, we called it the underground, no? The internet exploded the underground onto the surface in many ways, no? And so today we can have this conversation also with a broader public, you know? A lot more people are playing. You don't have to go to the wrong side of town anymore, thanks to our English community and people like Sam Roddick, who in 2001 created Coco de Mer, which became a business model for many erotic shops that were also female-focused. The idea, before Coco de Mer, that you could go into the right side of town or the safe side of town was unheard of. I mean, I would find myself in erotic shops, which of course were mostly, you know, for men or gay men, and they were always on the wrong side of town. In fact, I learned quite quickly in the 90s that I had to go into these shops with a man. Otherwise, I would be followed, I would be stalked afterwards. It was dangerous, no? For a woman to walk into those stores. So what happened, thanks to our community in the UK, is that a model was created with Coco de Mer. I mean, she really did make history, Sam Roddick, with that. And then there were other stores that followed now. And today, they're actually closing again because the internet has taken over that place and people can safely shop online for pretty much whatever they want. But in the 90s, being initiated was one of my privileges, really. And so when I wrote the Boudoir Bible, I really wrote it as an initiation because I think that with certain techniques and certain types of play, you do need to be initiated because there is the pushing of boundaries and the use of tools that can also be dangerous, no? And so learning how to use them correctly and respectfully and without hurting each other is key. So if nothing else, I mean, the Boudoir Bible is an initiation and it took place of those role models that I had, you know? And part of my work has been initiation. The elite had access to sexual information, sexual tools, etc. A certain kind of play, a certain kind of way, no? And today that is no longer the case. So I'm very excited about that. And I hope that my work has contributed to the breaking down of those elitarian barriers. You still might get shunned for it. They might say, they're gonna look at you and think, you know, she's wearing latex gloves and that's a bad girl, you know? But you won't end up in prison for it. You know, the first time I did a wellness salon, sexual wellness salon here in the UK at Soho House, it was 2001 or 2, And I remember saying, and I actually talk about it in the Boudoir Bible, I said to the people sitting in the room, this is exciting, because only 50 years ago, if we'd been caught, I would be put in prison, possibly into a mental institute, maybe even lobotomized. And every single person in this room would have been socially compromised. You may have lost your job. You may have had to leave the city. You definitely would have had issues, no? And this was in 2001 too. And only 50 years earlier, it was an issue, no? If you think about also that fabulous film about the history of, is his name William Marston? The man who created Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman was a kinky character. And funnily enough, she was one of my icons as a child. You know, I wanted to have her powers. I wanted to use the rope like that. I wanted those bracelets that empowered her. She had power because of her jewelry, no? She was a big inspiration for me. But Marston was kicked out of Harvard. His wife was also kicked out of Harvard and condemned because they had a polyamorous relationship that lasted their entire lives. So they were together as a threesome forever, but he was kicked out of Harvard, and so was she. And so we mustn't forget these things. And simply by having the conversation that we're having today, we actually keep it on the surface. And so you're contributing to the movement, and you're contributing to the fact that we keep our sexuality on the surface, and it's okay. Like, pleasure's okay. As long as nobody's getting hurt and it's consensual and no one's innocence is being infringed upon, it's all good, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I totally agree that I guess the transparency and being anonymous, non-anonymous, being how open you are is a very interesting question these days, because I feel like for people like me it's not a huge issue because I work in the creative industry, so it's kind of, it's okay. It's even, you even welcome kind of to be open because people are interested and want to learn from you sometimes, but I think there are still people for whom like their careers are not kind of, if they have a corporate job, they kind of have to hide it a little bit. And of course, if you're a parent, that's, I think you're also subject to much more scrutiny. So I think it's just always great to remind ourselves that that openness is something very precious.
Yes.
And especially when work also still gets censored, like on social media.
People said to me, you're crazy, oh, you're into BDSM, I didn't know you were a pervert. I was getting that kind of thing, you know, and I was like, don't put me in a category. Don't fence me in. Don't restrict me, and come on over. Let's talk about this, no? And the same objects that I designed between 30, 25, 20 years ago are still the ones that I am putting out there today, made to measure, and spreading pleasure, empowerment, information. And again, they're like cushions as much as they are like armor. If I'd been a man, it probably would have been much more safe, no? But I'm a woman talking about sex. And women who still today, in this environment that we're in, get stigmatized for it. Whereas a man is a Casanova, you know? It's that same sort of like, you know, whore, stud kind of phenomena. No?
Yeah, definitely.
Yes.
There's still obviously a very gendered perspective on what you are allowed and how you're allowed to express yourself, and like, in which position you're allowed to be.
When I was doing the research for the book, I read through the article that was written in Wallpaper. There were several different articles with Nick and Peter Saville. And Peter talked about projection. And it really helped me to sort of pinpoint what the biggest issue may be, you know, when you work as a woman in the sexual world. And Peter also experienced this because of his house in LA that was sort of like a Playboy house. And he said that the house was way bigger through projection than it actually was, no? And I think that also my space in Paris is probably way bigger through projection than it actually was, no? Very interesting point of view, no? But projection is one of maybe the biggest issues. And I thought it was interesting that Peter Saville also experienced this kind of, you know, other people's ideas being put on you, which can be constrictive. and it can limit us, no? So you have to be brave, and you have to keep on pushing through and never stop believing, you know? And again, I didn't think 30 years ago when I started this that I would be sitting here with you talking about a second book and the importance of staying on my mission, no matter what. And I understood that when I was tied, that something amazing would happen. And it was very, I would get kind of high, as you may know, you get kind of high. And it was a way to really hand over all the reins and explore another level of pleasure. Of course, also the power of trust, no? And the relationship between trust and enhanced pleasure. The idea that, for example, the ropes can be used for a sort of rebirthing process, no? The idea that the ropes can be used as a way to reintroduce someone to physical contact without me actually having physical contact with them, but contacting them and being in touch with them through the ropes, no? It's very, very powerful. Symbolically, what does it mean? You know, ropes are also things that we tie knots in, no? And I believe that there are a series of psychological knots that symbolically can be undone through the bondage process, no? So I began to incorporate the rope work into my method, which is ever evolving and has, I make use of certain tools and a certain language that is often connected to play and BDSM and bondage, etc. But I discovered that there's something very healing in that. And so as people that are part of the community, we understand that power. And to take that power out and use it as a healing device has been amazing, no? And it's also been very freeing for people who, for example, are victims of sexual abuse and survivors. I consider them all survivors. When they come to me, they're normally over 40, and they have decided, I'm going to take the reins of my sex life back. I mean, I've worked with people who haven't been touched for years. And the idea that you can touch them all over their body without actually ever touching them was a way that I have used the ropes also.
I think it's just something about how we connect our bodies these days. It's very interesting because quite often we're very disconnected because we live in our heads and like through keyboards we type on, through phones we looked at. So sometimes you can go through the day and forget you actually had a body. And like to me, like through practices like rope or through BDSM, you can kind of come back to it in a very powerful way. So, and I think it does bring up a lot of thoughts and emotions you didn't know you had stored somewhere, and then suddenly they like come up to the surface and you're like, wow, okay.
Yeah, it has a healing power, no?
Yeah, that's I'm also interested in, I think, wearable objects as something which brings you back to yourself, and I think this is very much true of what you make, because if it's something which you put on and you're constantly aware of it, it will just bring you back to your physical self.
Agreed. Agreed. Also the idea that you can have something to heal yourself or to please another. I mean, I go back to these iconic pieces that I think I designed them in 1996. And again, I feel naked without it. But I know that if you said to me, Betony, I have a headache, I would say, lean in, come over here and lean in. And there's a point here that I would touch with the rings, and I could heal your headache. I could also heal a lot of other things. How does an object empower you? I empower through the possibility to please. Whether you use it or not is up to you.
Do you have maybe a favorite image which is in there, or a favorite shoot which you worked on?
I love them all very much. I dedicated a little bit more space to Nick's work and to the work of Jeff Burton. With Jeff, I shot in the house of Carlo Molino, who's one of my favorite erotic designers, an Italian designer, who had built a house in Torino for his life after death. And it was where he shot all of the infamous Molino Polaroids. it was like a set. It was a stage that was also, for me, a very important reference in terms of the way that we construct a space that is erotically conducive. Now, I think that ambiance in the way that we build out a space is also a way that we turn each other on. No? And a lot of people don't think about that. And not everybody has the space in their homes to dedicate a room, but I think that transforming space is also transforming mind and body. And again, you know, I was working with an archive of 13,000 images, and to choose and to honor everyone was impossible. Otherwise you'd have to make a library of books, you know. So each image, yes, has its reason to be there, and I love them all.
And what does being photographed mean for you? Like being in front of the lens, and is it something empowering? Is it something pleasurable?
That's a good question.
Kind of, because there's a lot of photographs of you in the book,
I
of
know.
course. So I was just wondering what this process is like for you and how it feels.
Well, with the making of the book, one of the challenges was to include my imagery, which was inevitable, and not commit, you know, have it come off as a sort of vanity project. The reason I'm in the book a lot is because I was often asked to be photographed, and my work was the motor, the jewelry was the motor for these images. Sometimes I was also photographed because I was the only one that was willing to take her clothes off. Contrary to what a lot of people think, becoming that comfortable with your body is very empowering. Getting naked in front of the camera is empowering. I told myself at a certain point, I think I was 40, and I said, okay, that's it, I'm not going to do this again. And then I got a call from Irina Enescu, and she said, French Playboy wants to shoot you. And I was like, okay. And there I was, naked again. No? And it kept happening. No? I think today, maybe, the big challenge will be to accept at, I don't know, 60, to still get naked. And maybe at the same time, you know, try to dismantle the taboo of aging. No? I think I probably am obliged to do that. I mean, Vivienne Westwood did with Jürgen Teller.
Yeah, I think
that was brave.
It is incredible.
Incredible.
I think, just because it's something which is, same as you mentioned, people are not supposed to be talking about being sexual while being over, I don't know, 40, or I don't know, I don't even know where's the limit, but it's
menopause,
yeah,
for women.
I think it just seems, it's just not something we are exposed to, same as I think just being powerful in how you are, just would, yeah, I think it's incredible.
I think the power is in assuming your sexual persona really until the day you die. Because fact is, your desire doesn't go away, and your need to be touched, and the benefits of being hugged and loved and intimate with someone doesn't go away. The fact is, it keeps on with you. It doesn't go away, no? So I guess I've got some work to do. I'm certainly not getting any younger. Actually, being comfortable enough to saying, okay, I'm going to get naked, is something really empowering. And I'm very grateful that there were people who allowed me to shoot what I call bodyscapes. No, I really wanted the body had to be present in what I'm doing. And sometimes it was hard to present it in a way that was suggestive, because some of the jewelry that I do are actually made for the inside of the body. No? And so how do you represent that without, again, doing it in an erotic way without becoming pornographic? Now, one of the things that I have dreamt of doing and came very close to doing, I've written some script for some porn, and maybe one day, hopefully, I'll be able to realize those scripts. But for now, the use of the jewelry has been more suggestive and subliminated than actually putting them in action, well, outside of my own private films, no? There's still a lot to be done. I would love to direct some porn.
We talked a little bit before about physical spaces and how I think physical spaces are very important for like expressing our sexuality, but also I think if we talk about community, it's, you know, it's a space where we come together, or spaces where we express ourselves. So you've had quite a few very interesting spaces which you designed yourself in the past, and you're designing a new one you mentioned. So could you talk a little bit about what kind of working with space means for you, and what is your new space like?
Well, we know that environment can be conducive, to one thing or another. You know, if we step away from the erotic and we think of a learning environment, already you imagine what that looks like, right? It's organized, it's safe. I believe that control over an erotic environment is really important, especially when we play. You know, it mustn't be under-evaluated, because order is important. You know, if you're playing with the chords, you don't want to have chords that are dirty. You don't want to have chords that are worn or frayed, because that could be dangerous, right? You don't want to have chords that haven't been arranged. You know, when I pull a cord out of a drawer, I want to pull it out, I want it to be folded in the middle, and I want it to fall to the floor and begin a dance immediately. Because the way that I'm going to interact with your body, with each other, we're going to have a dance, right? The dance of the chords is a dance of energy as well. And if I'm sitting there like unraveling, or, oh my God, it's frayed, or it's broken, or I've just put you in danger, no, it breaks the rhythm. So the way that the ambience is controlled and set up before things start, allow things to become very spontaneous. Well, when you start to play with tools, you have to set yourself up, and your ambience has to be controlled. The environment has to be really conducive and ordered, and then you can let go and get spontaneous.
Is your approach like similar to your workspace as to it is to like more sexual space? Because I think like that thing about having your tools around.
Absolutely.
Like, being organized, being able to control the light. I'm like, it describes also a really good workspace as much as.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely similarities. And being organized is really important. It leads to productivity in the end, or creativity, you know? If I can't find things and there's a big mess, then I'm slowed down. So I'm a firm believer. I love to hide things now. When you come into my spaces that I design, all of the functional elements are hidden. So it becomes like a set.
And what are the things you're working on at the moment? What are your next projects or next big interests?
Well, this is a big one, because it's going to take about a year. And then I will, in fact, I'm very anxious to have my studio set back up. And I will be working on another book, which is very different from what I've done to date. I've kind of had to skirt around the social political aspects of my work, which I will not do any longer. I will tackle them straight on. I am also working on a series of objects in ceramic. I want to go back to carving wood, which is where I started in my very, very, very tender years with my father. My first materials in terms of sculpture was wood, and from the age of 6 on. And so I'm very much looking forward to delving into new materials. I will also be designing a lot of the lighting and furniture for the new space. And so it's a big project.